Good evening. My name is Sonia Varillo, and I'm your Genesee Valley Region Director. The Genesee Valley Region is made up of 73 units across Cayuga, Livingston, Monroe, Ontario, Seneca, Wayne, and Yates counties. This event was organized by our Associate Director, Rosalind Walker, Secretary Kim Bredenstein, Assistant Director Patricia Damon, and Echo Newsletter Editor Gary Elling. Again, welcome. We're glad that you're here.
Good evening, everyone. Before we get started, we want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from what is now known as Rochester, New York, and that these are the lands of the Seneca, which translates to the keeper of the Western Door. We thank and honor the host people of the land that our 7-county Genesee Region Valley PTA serves. The name Genesee is a derivative of the Seneca language word for pleasant bank or beautiful valley. Most of the schools in our region lay on the land of the Seneca. However, we also have a couple of PTAs in our region in the land of the Cayuga Nation. The Seneca and Cayuga Nations are 2 of 6 nations that form the Iroquois Confederacy. We recognize the unique relationship these Indigenous stewards have with this land as living people with a present and a future, as well as a past. That relationship is the core of their traditions, cultures, and histories. We also recognize the history of genocide, colonization, coerced and broken treaties, and forced assimilation of Indigenous people that has taken place on these lands. The Seneca and Cayuga people lived here, hunted here, farmed, fished, raised their children here, and buried their dead here. And this was long before any explorers came to this area. And the Cayuga and Seneca people are still here. Mindful of these histories, we work toward learning and acknowledging the truth, as well as understanding the impact of this history on the current structure of this land and its communities, with the ultimate goal being conciliation. As parent leaders, humbly understanding unadulterated history aids us in being better advocates for all children, irrespective of ethnicity, culture, and background, and it sows the ground for becoming a more welcoming and inclusive organization. And with that, I'd like to go into giving a little history about PTA. The PTA was founded in 1897 by a couple of women right down the road from us in Chautauqua, New York. And I found out just this year, me personally, that there were actually 2 PTAs here in the United States. There was a national PTA and there was a colored PTA that was started in 1926 by Selena Butler Sloan. And this colored PTA started because Black people had other issues and priorities that they didn't feel that the national PTA was advocating for, or that they needed more advocating about. So things such as, public schooling for children, because at the time, Black children weren't in public schools beyond elementary school for the most part. And other resources to just have equitable education for everyone. So the second organization began, and in 1970, the 2 organizations finally merged. And it took a lot of soul searching and a lot of negotiations for 5 years, from 1965 to 1970, before it happened. And during that time, there was concern that with the national PTA having 11 million members and the colored PTA having 250,000 members, that's a 44-to-1 ratio, and that the bigger organization might swallow up the smaller organization. And so thinking about that and where we currently are in PTA, just sort of keep that in mind, as we might see some, demographics and leadership and things that don't quite match up, that there was this history, and be cognizant of it and see how we can sort of alleviate those inequities that we still might see and imbalances in PTA participation. So with that, I want to also mention that when you purchase a PTA unit membership, it costs $4, but that $4 really does get you a lot. It gets you membership in 4 organizations. There's your local PTA, your regional PTA, which here is your Genesee Valley PTA, as well as the New York PTA and the national PTA. And you have all those resources, benefits, and advocacy at your disposal. And so with that, I want to introduce Namiko Suga from New York State PTA. She is our diversity coordinator, and she is going to bring you greetings and tell you a little bit more about the resources that are available to help with diversity and inclusivity initiatives here in your local PTAs. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Namiko.
Thank you. There was a rolling thing with challenges, and that was really fun. And I'm going to answer a couple of them right now. Hajimemashite onegai shimasu. Konbanwa. Watashi no namae wa Suga Namiko desu. And I am the new diversity coordinator at New York State PTA. Coming to you all the way virtually from Nassau region, Long Island. I'm honored to join you here this evening, and thank you very much for the invite, Rosalind. And I bring greetings on behalf of our new president, Dana Clayton, and the New York State PTA. But before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the strong leadership that you have here in Genesee Valley, and express our sincere appreciation to your region director, Sonia Verrillo. I met her briefly at conference, and I found her to be a lot of fun and very kind. She's an exceptional leader, and she's served your region very well over the past 2.5 years. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank each and every one of you here for being here tonight and for being here in general. Every one of you has an impact on the lives of children. Thank you for taking the time to be involved in the education of your children, because as you know, as a parent, we are the first teachers of our children. So my heartfelt thanks on behalf of the many, many millions of children, past and present, who are receiving a public education, for volunteering your time to serve the communities in which you live. And it really is my pleasure and an honor to participate in this special event with you tonight. And I know that I can count on each and every one of you to continue to enrich New York State PTA. And this is Dana's new slogan, to shine a light on every child with one voice. Dana has challenged each one of us to be a guiding light to make a difference for all children and youth. Together, we can be a beacon of hope and inspiration to every child, to make every child's potential a reality. So be well, stay safe, and thank you for everything that you do every day for our kids. That said, I'm going to put on my diversity coordinator hat, and I wanted to talk about, there was another little PDF PowerPoint that talks about how you can be more inclusive in PTA. And I just wanted to let you know that New York State PTA has a translation software that you can definitely take advantage of. I can put it in the chat. It's an email, translations@NewYorkStatePTA.org. And it's for flyers, letters. Of course, the best translators are the ones in your membership, right? You can cultivate leaders that way. You can bring in members that way. But if you're stuck, definitely send the email to translations@NewYorkStatePTA.org. It is software, but it's very good software apparently. So Kyle wanted me to let everybody know about that. And I also have the New York State Diversity, Inclusion, and Outreach Facebook group that I hope people will join. And we had some discussion back and forth on whether to make it a page or a group. I was against a page because pages kind of tell you things. And this closed group, I would like to make it a discussion on, you know, the things that you're going to learn tonight. Bring it, bring it to the Facebook group. If you have any questions, if you want to be challenged, or if you want to challenge someone, I definitely encourage that and welcome it. And I hope to see everyone there. Yeah, and there you go. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Namiko. Next, I want to introduce our guest presenter for this evening. Let me preface this by just asking everyone, who is parenting a teenager or has parented a teenager? Just wave a hand. Okay, this quick story. A few years ago, or a couple years ago, I went to a presentation that Shane Wiegand, our guest speaker, is going to share with us tonight. And I found the content so useful and engaging that I wanted to make sure my daughter heard it, because it's really that important. And so, as always, just think about, asking your teenager, your 15-year-old, to go to a lecture with you. So I asked her, oh, I want you to go to this lecture, and she's like, oh, Mom. And, and I had to sort of bribe her with, one of her favorite meals and things like that. But she went to the lecture, and as we were walking in, she's like, I don't see anybody here my age. Everybody looks old. And it's like, just come on in. It's going to be okay. And so she sat down, and again, looking around the room, she was the only youth in the room. And so again, just giving me the teenage static. She sat there and listened. But let me tell you, she was glued to the presentation. She was totally engaged and focused. And at the end of the presentation, she stayed behind after everybody asked her questions, because she wanted to talk to Shane herself and ask him some more questions and invite him to her school. So that gives you a little heads up about what you're in for this evening. And I think what I appreciated most is just the blunt honesty of just talking about history. That's really what we need. And I think you'll appreciate that too this evening. So let me give a quick introduction to Shane. He is the 4th grade teacher in the Rush-Henrietta School District, and he's the co-lead of Pathstone's Foundation Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. He has researched, compiled, and taught Rochester history of structural racism and resistance in his classroom for the past 8 years. Starting with 10 4th graders in his school district, Shane has now trained over 350 teachers in anti-racist curriculum across multiple districts. Shane is a board member of Connected Communities and City Roots Community Land Trust. He is an adjunct faculty instructor in the University of Rochester's Department of Neurology, where he lectures, leads workshops on anti-racism and equity. He and his wife live in the Beechwood neighborhood of Rochester. So without further ado, I am turning the presentation over to Shane Wiegand.
Can you hear me now? Was I the first person to make the Zoom fail? And oh, it had to be me. I did it. All right, so that's out of the way. I'm Shane Wiegand, like Rosalind said. I want to thank you and Sonia and your whole team at the Genesee Valley PTA for hosting me today to share this story of anti-racism in Rochester. And I'm so excited to tell you this story in the tradition of anti-racist educators and activists like Hannah Storrs, who got Little Black Sambo kicked out of the city school district, as well as made sure that Black history began to be taught in the city schools, thanks to tireless efforts, as well as incredible organizing, and her good friend, Dr. Walter Cooper. Dr. Cooper is on my board of directors for the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. He's a good friend. We talk almost every other week, and you'll see so much about him in here and just his influence on how to tell this story, a story I really couldn't be able to tell without him. But most of all, I wouldn't be here tonight sharing this story about racist policy and resistance in Rochester, in particular, taking a look at the way PTAs upheld segregation and institutional racism in our communities, and the ways PTAs today can be a part of challenging and subverting those structures of racism and making a more just and equitable Genesee Valley region. And I also would not be here today if it weren't for these 3 girls on the right, who I'm going to tell you a whole really cool story about at the end, as well as the one student about 8 or 9 years ago who, during Martin Luther King week, the one week of the year that we kind of talk about racism, and usually only in the South, asked me if racism happened in Rochester or in our area. Did people fight back against it here? Did Martin Luther King ever come to Rochester? Well, of course, Dr. Cooper, he knew the answers. He actually had dinner with Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and so many others who came to Rochester. And as I heard those stories from Cooper and started getting involved with groups like City Roots Land Trust fighting for housing justice in our community, I started learning a much deeper story about racist curriculum in our community, racist policies like redlining and racial covenants, and the brave students and adults and teachers who joined together to say, not in our town, we want to make a change. And I hope that today you'll be able to join me in taking a look at the ways that our community, our schools, and our PTA and government institutions participated in making racist policies and the ways that many resisted and that we might resist today. So a quick note, I am the co-lead of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project with Kelly McNair, who's the Director of Accountability for the Rochester City School District, and an amazing team of teachers who have taught this curriculum over the last few years and are now working with us to develop and train teachers all across Monroe County. And I'll talk more about that and how we can bring that to your school districts if that's something as a PTA and your school PTAs you want to advocate for. But we're going to take a hard look at some history tonight, mainly primary sources. One of the biggest sources, though, is Richard Rothstein's Color of Law. This is the book on redlining, national bestseller, New York Times list. He came to Rochester a few years ago. We were on the panel together. I got to pick him up from the airport. It was awesome. And he went through this whole presentation and played a big role in helping shape it and what you're going to see today. The New York State Commission on Segregation and Discrimination from 1958. The DNC, you're going to see a whole bunch from the Rochester Public Library's oral history projects with civil rights leaders in Rochester, and countless interviews that I've had the privilege and honor to get to do with people of color throughout the Rochester community, like Dr. Cooper and many others. Before we begin, though, I want to make sure that we're all kind of set with some similar definitions. And I'm going to use Ibram Kendi's definitions for racism, where he describes it as a marriage of racist policy and ideas that produce and normalize racial inequality. Whereas anti-racism or anti-racist is one who actively supports anti-racist policies through actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. The key is active, not passive, active. There's no such thing as not racist, Ibram Kendi says. And I would describe myself for most of my life as not racist. You know, I didn't really take any action to stop racism, but I wasn't doing anything racist. But Ibram Kendi says you're perpetuating racism if you're not doing anything about it. Because a racist is one who supports racist policies through actions or inaction. And I know for me, my inaction was promoting and allowing racist policies in our community to continue. And I hope tonight to talk about the way these definitions have played out in our community. But I want to acknowledge that I bet some of you have already kind of maybe cringed just a touch because you're like, wait, why is he talking about racism, anti-racism? Is he trying to say I'm a bad person? What's going on here? Not at all. But I do want to acknowledge this is something that socializing wise, we haven't really been socialized to talk about, and we don't often talk about. In fact, it's something maybe we're encouraged not to in our schools, in our churches, our places of worship and communities. But I think we have to talk about these things to move forward. And so in those moments where you feel discomfort, maybe a little defensive like I did when I first heard much of this story, I want you to notice it, be curious about those feelings, and remember this quote to help you center yourself. Robin DiAngelo, in her fantastic book, writes that the key to moving forward is what we do with our discomfort. Use it as a door out, blame the messenger and disregard the message, or use it as a door in and ask, why does this unsettle me? And what would it mean for me if this were true? Because the thing is, in Rochester, we've had huge problems before and in this whole region. In fact, slavery was quite at large in the early 1800s, right here in upstate New York. Bath, New York, Rochester, New York, and many of our towns and cities are named after people who owned enslaved Africans who were forced to work without pay in incredibly unjust conditions right here in our community. Yet many Black and white folks came together to solve these problems. And we're going to have to come together again to solve the problems we have today in the spirit of Frederick Douglass, who lived here in Rochester and fought for abolition. Austin Stewart, who was actually enslaved in Bath and then Sodus, New York, escaped to Rochester, where he opened the first separate and segregated school for Black students, separate and unequal, as well as a spot on the Underground Railroad. And when abolition came to New York State, he was the one who got to speak at the governor's big speech announcing abolition in our community. Of course, there are hundreds of African-American men and women and Latinx folks who fought against racism in the 1950s and 60s, and we'll talk a lot about them today. And we're going to have to come together like these folks did, because the Hard Facts Report says that in our region, in 2020, African-American kids, they're more than 4 times as likely than whites to live in poverty. Let that sink in. More than 4 times as likely as white children to live in poverty. Civil rights is not over. Both African Americans and Latinos are less than half as likely to own their own homes as their white counterparts, a staggering statistic about home ownership and wealth. When you look at the map of just the Rochester area for the population map, you can see an incredible concentration of people of color in the inner city and whiteness in the suburbs. Our area is one of the most segregated places in the country, a place where white privilege is literally life itself, where in fact, in Pittsford's 14534 zip code, which is majority white, a kid who's born there today is expected to live up to 9 years longer than a child from Rochester's previously redlined inner city 14608 zip code and that Clarissa Street area. Our schools in New York State are the most segregated schools in the country, more than Mississippi, more than Alabama, more than Florida. And in fact, the boundary between Rochester City School District and Penfield is the nation's #1 most segregated school district border in the entire country. Now, Brighton is #6 on that list. So what can we do about these problems today? We're going to have to come together to solve them the way Douglas and Stewart and so many others did. But the thing is, before we can come together, we have to know what the problem is and how we got here. And the thesis of my presentation tonight is this quote from the great James Baldwin, who writes that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I hope that tonight you will join me in facing head on the way people of color in our community always have, and folks like myself have not always. I hope we can face this history head on, the root causes of our current racial injustice, and come together like those in the past to solve these big problems that face us yet again. We're going to take a look at the local history of racist curriculum and the PTA's role in it. We're going to look at racial covenants in Monroe County, restrictive and racial covenants barring people of color from living in thousands of neighborhoods in our communities. We'll look at redlining in the National Housing Act of 1934, the way so many resisted. We'll take a look at the integration movement in Rochester and the PTA's role in that movement, as well as the anti-racist curriculum and the ways we can move forward. And then finally, we'll have discussion and Q&A focused on how PTAs can be a part of creating a change when it comes to racial injustice and supporting our schools and teachers as we move forward with this work. Because our legacy here in Rochester is one that's quite difficult to look at. And I want to say before I really dig into this, that as you can tell from this first image, there's going to be some uncomfortable and unsettling images that are from our community. In fact, here in Rochester, Little Black Sambo, an incredibly racist book, was something that every city school student, including Black children, were forced to read in their elementary school classrooms until the NAACP, with the guidance of Hannah Storrs, who you met on slide 1, fought back and finally, after much resistance from the white community and PTAs, were able to get this book out of their school classroom. The DNC editorial board actually defended this racist book, arguing that this shouldn't be something that should be taken out of schools, and it's just a great story. But we shouldn't be surprised because the DNC and all of the local newspapers throughout this 9-county region were talking quite a bit about explicit racist messages in their schools. In fact, the Honeyway Falls Parent-Teacher Association had an annual blackface minstrel show every year, as did almost every other school district in Monroe County and many of the other regions. And these really speak to the way racism was normalized and part of just the system and institution of schooling in our community. Take a look at Honeyway Falls Elementary School here, this blackface show in 1960, proudly published in the paper. Now, if you don't know what a minstrel show or a minstrel blackface show is, there's usually 4 or 5 main characters. You've got Jim Crow, Jim C-O-O-N, Jim Dandy, you have an old Black Joe, and sometimes a Mr. Bones or a Sambo character. These people dance and sing racist songs, mocking the intelligence of people of color. There's a lot of political commentary and other things that go on, but in fact, explicit messages of racism and segregation were being taught to kids all across our community. And I want to go a little overkill and show you some examples of these things. Notice the Genesee Valley PTA itself in 1949 put on a county-wide blackface minstrel show. Irondequoit High School, the PTA, they set up one of these shows every year. They called it the Dark Town Strutters, a black-faced show. Take a look at RCSD, almost every single school in the city school district. Notice the paper proudly published these absurdly racist photographs. School districts like Aquinas, Gates Chili. Again, notice the PTA advertising these in the Democrat and Chronicle. Penfield's Indian Landing Elementary School in 1954. The PTA at Ellwanger Berry, Hornell, Phelps, Geneseo, East Irondequoit. Notice the Durand Eastman PTA. The PTA at Wayne Central in the 60s, Brighton putting on the show Licorice Lights, Bloomfield. You can see West Henrietta, where I teach fourth grade in Rush-Henrietta. Spencerport had an annual show. The Cub Scouts even involved. Greece, put on by a teacher at the school, who proudly said this play proves grown-ups aren't the only ones who can black their faces to perform the dancing, singing, and wisecracking. The town supervisor of Webster, later our DA of all of Monroe County, would write and perform in this show every year, along with students from Webster High School Singing Club. Kodak had an annual show that they proudly published in their magazines. The Jewish Youth Association put on these racist shows. Private schools like Allendale, Columbia had these shows every year, even sometimes hosting them at the Rochester Memorial Art Gallery, proudly supported by their parent-teacher associations. Churches, Catholic and Protestant alike, like these in Pittsburgh, Masons, Rotaries, Grangers, all were involved. You can see here at Newark Junior High School, RIT had an annual show, U of R, and here are some of the other towns where I found a show that happened almost every single year from the early 1900s until 1968, when after the assassination of Dr. King, these shows started to end, and also thanks to the activism of many people of color who pushed back on these shows. See Quentin Primo, the head of the NAACP in Rochester. He wrote a letter to the editor and the DNC calling these shows out for what they were, demanding that these shows must be banned from all public and private schools, churches, and public buildings. To do otherwise will cripple permanently the attitudes of all white youth involved in these community-accepted shows towards all of the dark-skinned people of the world. And yet it took a good 7 to 10 years longer for these things to start to change and for PTAs to stop endorsing and allowing these things to happen. Dr. Alice Holloway Young, I want to tell you a little bit about her. First Black principal in the Rochester City School District, someone who put her foot down when it came to these shows and fought for anti-racist curriculum in her classrooms. Now, she is not just an anti-racist educator and a hero in Rochester. She was a founder of Monroe Community College, an incredible human being and a friend of mine. And I want to tell you her story and talk a little bit about the ways the real estate industry and then redlining and racial covenants affected her life and many others. So the real estate industry, for a number of years, actually in its code of ethics, it said until 1956 that a real estate agent would lose their license if they showed a person of color a home in a white neighborhood. Not a single real estate agent in town would show Dr. Alice Holloway Young, a doctor of philosophy and education, a home in a white neighborhood. The 19th Ward was where she wanted to live. She wasn't allowed to live there. No bank would pre-approve her for a mortgage. So she did what the 57 other people of color who were able to move out of these red line neighborhoods in the city did. They found a wealthy white person to act as a dummy or straw man buyer. Meet Harper Sibley, the Western Union Telegraph fortune, member of the NAACP. She bought a house for Alice Young in the 19th Ward on Millbank Street, secretly sold it to her under the table with a private mortgage. The day after moving in, the Youngs find this horrific note that I will not read to you in their mailbox from the Ku Klux Klan of Millbank Street. They faced decades of racial terror and abuse from many of their neighbors, but they refused to leave. Dr. Young, when we've had lunch, has mentioned that when I tell her story, I don't forget to tell the story of the Bushes, the only white family on the street who stood with them and helped protect them from the racial abuse that they faced. We don't think of our community as a Klan community, but in Rochester, we would host the New York State Klan Vacation every year in the 1920s and 30s. This is East Rochester High School's football practice field, where 8,000 Klansmen gathered to burn 3 50-foot-high burning crosses. And the next day, a gathering of 20,000 hooded men and women marched through the streets of downtown East Rochester, with folks gathered from all over the greater Rochester community and larger region. The next area of racist policy I want to look at that shapes our community, and is really important part of the segregation that we see today and a cause of it, is something called racially restrictive covenants that really weren't barred until 1968. This summer, my students and myself got to work with a number of students at Yale Law School's Environmental Policy Protection Clinic, and we published this massive report documenting these racial covenants. A racial covenant, if you're not aware, is in someone's deed. So when you get a deed, everybody who owns a home has a deed that says they own their house and there's rules for how you can use it. Some of these rules are really normal. Like if you look at number 5, like no more than 5 or 7 feet from the rear lot line. You got to be careful with what you do with your detached garage. You can't have a distiller in your backyard. Stuff I'm pretty glad my neighbors in the city can't do. But if you look at number 5, it says the dwelling shall be occupied by persons of the Caucasian race only. These were legally binding. These were enforced by real estate agents and police officers in our community when people of color would try to move in, and they were incredibly effective at keeping our community segregated. And to show you the extent of what was happening with these racially restrictive covenants, meet County Manager Clarence Smith. Adam Bello has his job today here in Monroe County. He and the entire legislature, whenever they sold a foreclosed property, like these several whole neighborhoods in Irondequoit that foreclosed during the Depression, on every one of these houses, they made sure a racial covenant saying no person of any race other than the Caucasian shall use or occupy any building. This is de jure racial segregation from the highest government in Monroe County. And you can see his signature right there. These are all still on the deeds, no longer enforceable, and they're all right at the county clerk's office. You can go take a look. Kodak got involved too. Vice President of Kodak, Harry Haight, who founded ESL Bank, they built this neighborhood in Brighton called Meadowbrook, 371 carefully planned homes. And on those houses, every single house, as stipulated by Kodak and financed by ESL Bank, which was formed to finance these dwellings, it said no lot shall ever be occupied by a Black person. And it's really cool that ESNL is one of the funders of our project today, and youth and adults in the Meadowbrook neighborhood, after our report was published this summer, they actually came together and all of them signed on and changed their deed to not cross it out, but to add a statement of anti-racism and welcome onto their deed. The power of both youth and parent activism is incredible. But it wasn't just places like Meadowbrook or Irondequoit. Brighton had hundreds of others in many neighborhoods, like Council Rock Estates, that were even advertised in the Democrat and Chronicle. This was something the paper, the government, all participated. Even schools like Thomas Edison School, number 4 in Gates, today Hope Hall. The school board and town board signed on to this covenant in 1941, saying it should not be used by any member except by the Caucasian race. All along Oak Hill and Pittsford, you can see these also advertised. Parrington and East Rochester had these covenants. Over 2,000 homes in Northwest Irondequoit by the zoo there. Notice one of those homes, Walter Wegman, founder of Wegman's Friendly Food Markets, agreed to this racist covenant, even though he didn't have to, and made sure it stayed on there when he sold his home several years later. Forest Lawn and Webster, notice Italian and Polish people were restricted. Oftentimes Jewish folks would be included on these. Look at Penfield, several different neighborhoods all throughout Greece. Gates, the president of the Rochester Builders Association, Norman Huck, signed hundreds of these into the Brooklyn Heights Estates tract, along with his co-partner in building, the head of the real estate board, Frank Drum. You can see the head of the Rochester Bar also put these racial covenants in the homes that he built throughout our community. Several neighborhoods in Rochester, like mine here in Beechwood, North Winton, Browncroft neighborhoods, and the 19th Ward. Meet Judge Davis, who fought back against these with his friends at the NAACP. He says, I was looking for a house. It was 1958. We saw a house we liked in 135 Elmdorf Ave in Rochester, a block or so west of Genesee. The owner refused to sell to us because we were Black, and there was a restrictive covenant in the deed, like the ones I just showed you, that these houses, when built, were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians. Quick note before I go on. In 1944, Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European folks had up to that point been deemed people of color. Not as bad as being Black, according to the federal government, but less than Caucasian. They officially became white or Caucasian in 1944, thanks to the eugenic science of the time, and the GI Bill, which legally allowed those folks to have access to home ownership and legally be classified as white. Whereas people of color who served in World War II did not have that same access to the GI Bill and didn't have access to federally financed VA loans. So here's his house, 135 Elmdorf Ave. He says, I was active in the NAACP at that time, and a white friend bought the house and transferred it to me. We had to go through these kinds of devious methods in order to find housing. I think it was typical and a difficulty for getting decent, safe housing, even if you could afford it, like he was as a lawyer. To my knowledge, there were very few persons of color living in the towns, very few in Henrietta, none in Pittsford, very few in Irondequoit, none in the towns of Webster or west of the city, Gates, Greece, practically none. And here are the places across Rochester, each of these Black spaces where we see racial covenants today. Now, I've only had access to the Monroe County Clerk's office. I haven't been able to go into some of the other regions I know some of you are from, but you can go down to your clerk's office and start digging around if you'd like, and I think that would be incredible. The next area of racist policy I want to look at, though, is probably the most important and influential to creating the segregation in our communities we see today. This is the National Housing Act that came out of the New Deal, the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president, the housing shortage and crisis. He's got to act fast and do something. So he signs into law this act that gives out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance. It helps 35 million people have access to home ownership for the first time and build generational wealth, including both of my grandfathers. But people of color were explicitly excluded in this law. Notice it says if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Any change in social or racial occupancy leads to instability and a reduction in values. It goes on to mandate that racial deed restrictions be put into place if a builder wants to get federal financing to buy supplies up front for a new suburban housing tract. And this is what happened all across our communities, where builders, to get this federal financing, put into their deeds the prohibition of occupancy of properties except by the race for which they were intended. So how is this enforced? Racial covenants was one way, but these maps that were created were the other. This is where that term redlining comes into play. Take a look at here at Rochester, New York. You'll notice here, this is sort of that inner city area. We have Irondequoit over here, Webster over here, Brighton, Cobbs Hill, 19th Ward. This is Greece. Our suburbs are pretty tiny. Most people are living in these sort of areas here. And so what happened is all across the country, these maps were made by the federal government. Assessors came in and rated neighborhoods best, desirable, declining, or hazardous, and gave them colors that mandated who was allowed to live where. Green and blue areas were deemed best and worthy of mortgage insurance because they were 100% white, middle, and upper middle class. Yellow meant slightly poorer, maybe your interest rate would be worse, and red meant no lending allowed. This is where people of color should be steered because it's where people of color had already been steered and were living, and therefore disinvestment should continue to happen in those neighborhoods, as well as those neighborhoods should be walled off through things like highways, the Inner Loop and 490 that came through downtown Rochester, something mandated in that FHA underwriting manual. So let's take a look though at some of these assessors reports in case you're not sure you believe what I'm saying. This is Cornhill, Redline neighborhood, 14608 zip code. Remember, a kid born there today is expected to live up to 9 years less, according to Common Ground Health, than a kid who lives in Pittsford. Notice it was 75% Black, 10% foreign, and the income's around $1,000. Therefore, redlined. Apartment complexes, no investment, really difficult to get any kind of home ownership going. Take a look at Pittsford, East Avenue Estates, had those racial covenants by Oak Hill, 0% Black, 0% foreign, quadruple the income. My neighborhood, Beechwood, 2% Black, 30% foreign, therefore redlined, no investment. Whereas Kodak's Meadowbrook neighborhood in Brighton, 20 years after it was built, was still 0% Black, mostly businessmen executives, therefore deemed green-lined best. You can compare Plex, East Irondequoit, and see this pattern continues. And that's what we try to do with our kids. We want them to look for patterns. I'm not going to tell them about it the way I'm telling all of you. We want them to look at and interpret, what did this mean? How might that impact our community? And then tell them the stories of people like Dr. Cooper and let them draw their own conclusions. Well, Dr. Cooper, the Democrat and Chronicle, they reported that 11 individual people of color lived in Henrietta in 1960, and that Henrietta was the most integrated suburb of Rochester. And I hope that gives you a little scope and scale for just how effective redlining and covenants were in our community. Dr. Cooper, he and his wife Helen looked at 69 apartments before finding a place to live in the redlined Beechwood neighborhood where I live today. Meanwhile, in Monroe County, 80% of all Black people lived in just two neighborhoods, the 3rd and 7th wards, according to the New York State Commission on Discrimination in 1958. According to Richard Rothstein, during the same period, white families benefited immensely. The FHA and VA gave out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance, or government handouts that allowed people like my family to buy a house for the first time. 35 million families benefited from these FHA and VA-backed loans, and 98% of them were white. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that a few people of color were able to get in, which allows for that 2% there at the end. The New York State Commission Against Discrimination goes on and tells us a few other statistics, one that seems really important to me, that in these two neighborhoods, this disinvestment led to dilapidation and slums because there was an investment that was allowed, and 30% of all units had no running water in these neighborhoods where people of color were living. Meanwhile, people of color who tried to move out to the suburbs, people who had a little bit more means and were part of the NAACP, like the Biases, met quite a bit of trouble. This is Thomas and Ermina Bias. He was a dentist. They bought a house in Irondequoit, and very quickly after moving in 1964, they had rocks thrown through their living room window. The racial abuse led them to sell their house and join the Coopers and Lees and the 11 other people of color who had moved to Henrietta at that time for a little bit of solidarity and strength to resist the racism they faced there. The report talks about Dick Ricketts. Rochester's NBA team, if you didn't know, was called the Royals, and Dick Ricketts was the star. It took him 16 months to find an apartment, though, because of the color of his skin. Peter Tulliver in 1960 tried to buy a house in Verena Drive in Brighton. All of his neighbors banded together, at least a majority, and they tried to buy the house out from under him at the bank before the final deal was closed. They were successful. The NAACP and Tulliver sued and eventually were successful in winning that house back. His wife, who's still with us, she still lives in that home to this day. They found that not a single person of color was given an FHA or VA loan in any of Rochester's suburbs. Meanwhile, when it came to integration, Brown versus Board was passed in the 1950s. And I know we've all seen pictures like this one here of Elizabeth Eckford. Well, Monroe County schools were almost 100% white in the suburbs, and many of the outer city schools, outer ring city schools, were 100% white as well. So Dr. Cooper and others sued the city school district in 1962. And 10 years later, school integration, or reorganization as it was called, in 1971 began. And just like this image of Elizabeth Eckford facing racial terror and abuse, trying to go to school in Arkansas, this is outside of Charlotte High School, led by a PTA parent, Mary Nicolisi, who was involved in the anti-school integration movement right here in Rochester. Her and a number of parents and youth formed a violent protest outside of Charlotte as students of color tried to come in to take their school examinations. We don't think about this as being Rochester, but take a look at when integration was just starting to be talked about. In 1966, over 150 students and parents protested outside of Marshall High School, holding signs saying, "Black people go home and keep Marshall clean." Meanwhile, at Charlotte High School, the tension developed. The DNC reported that after 3 Black girls were cut by flying glass on a bus that was stoned by these parents and youth hiding in the Holy Sepulchre graveyard. James Beard, the BSU president that organized to protect Black students, talks about his experience riding the bus to school. He says, "We were on a bus, and as soon as we got to the graveyard in Lake Ave, they'd hide in the graveyard behind the wall and come out from behind it throwing bricks, rocks, iron, anything that they could find to throw at the bus. They bust windows, and people would start screaming." So they organized this amazing group of students, the majority of the students of color at this school. They would even, Black men would escort the young women to class to keep them safe from the racial abuse that was happening in these schools. And yet James Beard, in an interview with DNC reporter Justin Murphy, described the whole thing as worth it because of the experiences he had going from a 100% school where every student was a person of color and living in a majority Black neighborhood in the 3rd Ward, to all of a sudden meeting people different from him for the first time, from learning that not all white people were awful, even though many were pretty rough at his school. He describes actually saying, "I'd started to develop friendships with those young white guys. I had a consciousness shift. My revolutionary attitude of all white people need to die," which I can imagine thinking if I was trying to go to school and rocks were getting thrown at me in glass bottles, right? But still, he said, "I had a consciousness shift." Regardless of what was going on at Charlotte, I then knew, wait a minute, all white people aren't like that. I love some of these people. I know it sounds crazy, but at the same time, I'm grateful for that. And that's his experience. That's his story. That's not the experience of everyone that did that in Charlotte. And yet I think it speaks to the value still of what was happening with integration at the time, albeit the incredible obstacles and difficulty of it. So you got to wonder, what was going on with this group here? A long legacy here at the Genesee Valley District PTA. Well, in 1973, the Democrat and Chronicle did an article about how the PTA was silent on the integration issue in the Rochester City School District and suburbs. In fact, the title of this March article was "PTA Voice Shrinks from Powerful Roar to a Purr." In the article, they described the PTA dropping from 8,000 to 4,000 members in just 6 short years, talking about how not a single PTA meeting was held during those 2 years of attempted school integration in the city. PTA president at the time, Donald Zalwig, said the reason he called no meetings was because they wanted to not have any stance on integration and the school reorganization. And I want you to think back to Ibram Kendi's definition of racism. Or racism is action or inaction that allows racist systems to continue to perpetuate and cause racial inequality. It's sad that these parents decided not to join in on doing the right thing. And yet I think we have a chance again today because we have these same obstacles today. We are one of the most segregated school district areas in the entire country. Our community is marked by segregation, rooted in racial covenants and redlining. And so I hope that in order to move forward with this, you've been able to join me in living out this quote from James Baldwin, who writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I hope you've had the courage and the stamina to stay with me tonight and face head on the local history of racist curriculum in PTAs, the way Kenton Primo did when he challenged these racist minstrel shows in the paper, the way Hannah Storrs did when she forced Black history into the city school district, at least in some of the classrooms, the way people like Judge Davis stood up to racially restrictive covenants by winning that house in the 19th Ward against insurmountable odds, the way folks like Connie Mitchell and Alice Young and the Biases and Coopers fought back against redlining and dared to move into suburban towns that did not want them, facing that racial terror, and yet coming together in solidarity to say, we stand for what we believe in. We have dignity and respect, and we will not back down. And I hope you saw those acts of resistance of people like James Beard, who fought for integration, and there's several students of color at his school who joined together and organized to protest and protect themselves, to advocate for their right to an education that every student deserves. And finally, I want to take a look a little bit at about what we can do to move forward with these issues and talk a little bit about how anti-racist curriculum that tells the stories of the people that you saw tonight, as well as the difficult pieces of our history, those hard, uncomfortable pieces of our history in our region, that if we don't look at, we can't move forward. And that I know, because I know from my last 8 years of teaching, that when kids learn these stories, they are inspired to create change and want to build a more just and equitable Rochester region. So if you take a look, this is Hannah Storrs, who I mentioned earlier, and we want to try to do this in the spirit of her and Dr. Cooper and so many others. I know for me, I grew up in Webster Central School District. I loved my time there, and yet I never learned that Connie Mitchell was the first Black person to be elected to public office. I never learned about Alice Young and her fight for housing integration. I never knew about Dr. Cooper and his battle against integration in the city school district. Instead, I learned that Abraham Lincoln, and I never learned about Austin Stewart, who was enslaved right down the road from us in Rochester, or that Rochester was named for a person who owned several people and brought them with him to Rochester. He brought 13 enslaved Africans with him to Rochester, and he bought this land here by selling over 40 other folks from Maryland when he moved up here. Just staggering. And yet I just learned slavery was this bad thing in the South. Abraham Lincoln came, ended it. And then, we had kind of some okay times. Things were getting better for people of color, but there was a little problem in the South with schools, and school integration was bad down there, segregation and lunch counters. And so Martin Luther King marched and spoke. Rosa Parks sat down in the bus, and then things changed. The laws, Lyndon signed the laws, and then Barack Obama became president, and we're post-racial. No more problems with racism. And of course, we know that's not true. And as we look at our community today and the racial disparity, the segregation, and the unequal outcomes for our students of color, especially in our classrooms and Latinx students, we have to do something where kids see themselves in their school curriculum and stories. And so we've assembled this incredible team of anti-racist educators with lived experience who have taught this in their classrooms and lived these things in their lives and been a part of these anti-racist efforts. Our mission is to empower students and teachers, educational leaders, and groups like PTAs to come together and support students and educators with creating and implementing and evaluating a curriculum that students can use to explore and interpret our local history, examining a fuller, more complete picture through rich primary sources. We don't want to indoctrinate students. We don't show them this presentation. Instead, we present them with primary sources and give them the tools to think critically, participate in civic action, and draw their own conclusions about what happened in our community, so they can be informed, active, and engaged citizens like so many folks have been in the past. And to me, what the soul of the PTA is civic action and creating positive change. So our vision is that every kid in Monroe County and eventually across our state will learn their local history when it comes to redlining and covenants, racist curriculum, and learn about the legacy of those who fought against racism, and if they so choose, to participate in creating those changes today. The way we've done this so far is through creating case studies that are 5 or 6 day units of study that introduce kids to these primary sources. But we also pulled together an amazing advisory board of district superintendents, New York State Regent Wade Morwood, Dean of the Werner School, Sarah Payray, and a number of other incredible folks like Dr. Walter Cooper or Joan Coles, whose father Howard ran the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper in Rochester, and so many other folks in our community that have had a crucial role in helping shape this curriculum and make it something that really can be used and institutionalized as systemic anti-racist change in school districts. So it's place-based. We try to make it super culturally responsive, right in with those New York State standards, teaching tolerance standards. We make it for each grade level developmentally appropriate. And we've had teachers and students testing and vetting all of this work out. And it's tied to those standards. We use Ibram Kendi's definitions, not as like the rule, but as something for students to think about, to push back on, and then in their own words, define what they see as this based on their own experiences. Students use restorative practices and circles to create group norms and have conversations about these issues in a safe, respectful way, learning how to participate in civic discourse, and really learning what it means to be a participant in your community and talk about problems like these based on text. And it's been powerful to do that. We also give students these superhero roles, these 4 different roles to look at each primary source to determine, is it credible? What do we know about who wrote it? Can we trust them? What do we know about the mystery of this source? What is going on in these kids' classrooms? We talk about the context, the main idea, help kids draw their own conclusions. First, looking at the mystery source of our census data and our hard facts report from ACT Rochester, which covers the 9-county region. We look at the redlining maps, and then kids get a chance to choose an activist or a racist incident that someone of color fought, like minstrel shows, or people of color who ran for public office or fought back against racial covenants, or people like Clarence A. Smith, who continued this segregation in our community. Finally, Dr. Cooper has actually helped us write stories, and we've teamed up with a local children's author, and we have children's books that kids from ages 2nd grade and on can read in their classrooms to learn about these stories and learn about what it means to be an activist and create positive change. And we're working in grades 2, 4, 5, grade 8, grades 11, and 12. And also we're supporting the really good work that the superintendents in Monroe County and the CUES program at U of R are working on to create some similar curriculum that's more focused on the uprising in 1964. And we're giving our primary sources and we're working collaboratively with them to support that really good work. And the reason why I do this, and the reason why I spend so much time and would come to this meeting after a long day of work to share this story with you, is because of 3 special students. I want you to meet Kaliat, this girl right here in the middle, who several years ago, after learning about Dr. Cooper right here and Alice Young right here, she learned about them and about redlining, and then she looked at our school critically. And in our restorative circle about, what are the problems you see today? She said, our school is racist because there's no Black teachers here. We don't have any Black teachers. I want a teacher who looks like me. Like, you're fine, Mr. Wiegand, but like, how come the white kids get teachers that look like them? I want someone who looks like me. And I said, you're absolutely right. What are we going to do about it? What did Dr. Cooper and Alice Young do? She's like, they got their friends together and they researched and they had their demands. They knew what to do. And so that's what we did. We got Bailey and Simra. The parents gave permission. And every day at lunch for a month, we met, we researched, we learned about the ways that they resisted in the past. We found we had 11 Black teachers in Henrietta, which was more than every East Side school district combined. And we had 550 white teachers. And the chance of Kaliat having a teacher that looked like her was almost 0 by the time she graduated high school. And we also found a statistic that said, if Kaliat has 1 Black teacher, if you're a student of color, you have 1 Black teacher in your 12 years of school, your chance of graduation goes up by 30%. So they sat down with their principal, they presented their slideshow and their facts, their list of demands, and that guy didn't know what to do. So he sent him to the assistant superintendent of hiring and the other assistant superintendents, and then the school board, and then the community foundation did a big story about these girls that went all across our community. And because of these girls, our district now has a relationship with 3 historically Black colleges in Atlanta and has begun a feeder pattern so that we can actively recruit, creating anti-racist policies for our hiring so that these girls receive a teacher that they truly deserve by the time they graduate, and hopefully many more. And so some of the ways that I think that we can create some change, and then I'll open up for Q&A, is I think that teachers, students, parents, we need to learn this history. What I told you tonight, I could have talked for 4 straight hours about this local history and gone into details from every single town and the activists there. I just gave you a blip. We've got to do our homework, just like we tell our kids, and we got to learn this story so that we can change it. We need to take a look at the history of those who have fought back, look at that systemic racism, identify those places like we started to tonight. Take a look at those primary sources, not just what people have to say, but what are the primary sources? Let's look at them together. Let's come to solid conclusions about our facts, and let's organize around these things using restorative practices to talk about these in ways that are safe, just like we do with kids. Let's make sure we create space to talk about it and to participate in racial injustice and anti-racist efforts, using things like the Teaching Tolerance website and their social justice standards to provide great, appropriate, developmentally appropriate ways for kids in ages kindergarten through grade 12 to participate in efforts around identity, diversity, justice, and activism. And we use those in each of our curriculum projects. We need administrators to support this work for teachers. And most of all, we need community support. You would not believe the pushback in many of the school districts in Rochester suburbs that have started doing some of this work. And it's been incredible. And we need brave groups of PTAs to come together and say, we want our kids to learn the truth about our community, the warts and all, and we want our kids to be empowered to be like Dr. Cooper and Hannah Storrs and Alice Young and stand up for what they believe is right. These things, I think, are going to be huge. And so as we break, and I'll turn it back over to Rosalind, I want us to think about these sort of 3 questions. And the first question, I want everyone to just open your chat box. If you don't know where your chat box is, click on the More button on the bottom right, and you'll see where it says Chat right at the top. And when that opens up, I want you to type in what grade you were in when you had your first Black teacher. So for me, I'm going to write no grade because I never had a teacher of color, K through college. And if you had more than one, type in both grades. Take a look at the responses of others. What's up, Krupa? I think this says a lot here. Just taking a look at these things and speaking to the ways that segregation and racism can kind of just the banality of it in our lives and experiences. I know for me, it didn't occur to me until one of my students asked me that question, that I had gone to a segregated school in Webster. I'd never had a Black teacher, and I didn't sit next to a Black student, I think, until I was a senior in high school. And that is staggering to think about in our community. And it's something that we've got to change. I thank you for your participation in the chat, and I hope that you'll join us in thinking about these questions. How have you been impacted by or benefited from these racist policies? So for me, I benefited big time from these racist policies. Both of my grandparents, they got FHA and VA loans that allowed them to buy houses that they couldn't have bought without that government handout. That allowed them to build wealth, buy bigger houses, send my parents, and help send me to college. Think about that, something denied to people of color until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. So feel free to also type in the chat the ways you've been impacted, or maybe you've benefited from these policies like I mentioned. I know I've been impacted negatively in that I never got to learn from a teacher of color. I didn't get to ever have a person of color be an authority over me growing up, a valuable and incredibly important lesson. And I think I was very much hurt by that. So feel free to think about that, share it in the chat, or we'll open up to that conversation. And the other question that I want us to think about is, how can PTAs be part of creating anti-racist change in our schools? Whether it's curriculum, whether it's hiring, a whole host of things. I would love to hear your thoughts. I will post these questions right in the chat right now, just in case you forget them. And then I'd love to invite folks, if you're willing, to unmute your screens, and I'll turn it back over to Rosalind so we can kind of have a conversation. And of course, I'd love to hear your pushback, feedback, critique, or your own personal stories in connection to the story, albeit only a little bit of this community story that I just told. And I'm so excited to hear from you and plan with you for how we can create a community that we can be truly proud to live in. So Rosalind, thank you for having me. I'll turn it right back over to you, and looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Shane. That was a great presentation. The content very timely. I think as most people listen to the presentation, they could think of things that they experienced when they were younger, from just like all the different people that you mentioned here in Rochester that went through different experiences. And then they probably also thought about some things that are probably similar today and, you know, just done in a different way. And so we want to talk about those things, and we're going to, before we go and open up for discussion, I want to bring on Felicia Smith. She is the director of the Urban-Suburban program, and she wants to share a little bit about that with you. And as you couldn't understand, the Urban-Suburban program started pretty much when integration was put in the policy here in the US. And like I said, it's had its challenges over the years too. So this talk morphs into that, and, you know, trying another method of trying to integrate our schools a little bit. So with that, welcome Felicia Smith.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. Again, good evening, everyone. My name is Felicia Smith. I'm the director of Urban-Suburban Interdistrict Transfer Program. We are a program of Monroe One BOCES. And again, I'd just like to thank Genesee Valley Region Parent Teacher Association and all of its great leaders for this opportunity to share a little information on Urban-Suburban. When I think about Shane's awesome presentation, it was really eye-opening for me as well. Growing up here in Rochester, going to the schools, and a lot of the change makers that he mentioned, I was just so shocked at all of the things that they've done for our community, because a lot of them I know, and I didn't know all that they've devoted to improving the lives of everyone in our communities. So thank you, Shane. I just thought that was so awesome. Just to give you a little bit about Urban-Suburban, Shane talked a lot about what happened in the 60s and regulations and integration. Well, Urban-Suburban started in 1965, and it was really birthed out of the racial disturbances of the 60s, specifically the uprising in 1964, where it made people start to think, and educators and Albany, the Commissioner of Education, you know, we have to do something about this. Our communities are so segregated. And he polled all of the schools in New York State, all of the districts, and most of them said they didn't have a problem. But fortunately, West Irondequoit did see that there was a problem. They were totally Caucasian, and they weren't benefiting from having diversity in their schools. So West Irondequoit was the first district to actually participate in the Urban-Suburban program. And in 1965, they joined Urban-Suburban. In 1966, a project called Unique was established, and that had 9 components, and Urban-Suburban was one of those components. And the main basis was to address the lack of basic needs for families in the Rochester city and the community, because there was a lack of fair housing, water, jobs, just some basic essential things. So Project Unique was really there to help to level the playing ground. And again, Urban-Suburban was one of those 9 components. So thankfully, West Irondequoit joined in 1965, and several other districts joined in 1968. And today, I'm happy to say we have 14 suburban districts that voluntarily participate in the Urban-Suburban program. We are the first and the oldest voluntary desegregation program. And our mission truly is to voluntarily decrease racial isolation, decrease poverty, and to enhance opportunities for students not only in the Rochester City School District, but surrounding areas. So that is why when you look at the Urban-Suburban logo, you'll see a two-way arrow, because the benefits are immense for both city and urban communities when that partnership happens. You're probably thinking, that sounds good. It has not been an easy path for the history of Urban-Suburban, and more details can be found in a really nice short 8-minute video that is located on our website at monroe.edu/US. But primarily, I just wanted to really thank again Genesee Valley for the opportunity to talk about how different facets, especially PTA, can help to impact and to diversify. And we do have some of our parent advisory council members who are like the boots on the ground for Urban-Suburban. They're parent volunteers that have children in the program that are experiencing the PTA experiences from a really helpful lens. So you're probably wondering, how does Urban-Suburban work? Well, those 14 voluntary districts, from the month of October to February, we accept applications from city residents with children in grades pre-K to 8th grade. And we close the window in February and compile records so that those districts, the 14 districts, can come in and take a look and actually start to interview families for a possible placement. So it's not a first come, first serve. It's basically open seats in their districts that are filled with Urban-Suburban applicants. So it's a true application process, and it's really based on open seats and the students' actual merits. And a really big piece is the parental involvement and engagement. So our program is truly a partnership. It's a partnership with the student, the parent, the district, and Urban-Suburban. And we know for change to happen, you have to have true and clear partnerships and everyone pulling in the same direction. And our direction is opportunity, access, and to see students and communities work together and improve. Did you guys need me to name like all of the districts that participate? I can. I'll go really quick. I'm only slotted for 3 minutes. I don't want to slow anything down. So Brighton, Brockport, East Rochester, Fairport, Hilton, Honeoye Falls, Lima, Penfield, Pittsford, Rush-Henrietta, Spencerport, Webster, West Irondequoit, and Wheatland Chi-Li currently participate in the Urban-Suburban program.
Okay, thank you, Felicia.
You're welcome.
So now we're going to open it up for Q&A. We have some questions, but I have a feeling you probably all have your own questions. So first, I want to give you an opportunity. You can use the raised hand on Zoom to catch our attention. We have a few people looking now.
I see one from Jennifer in the chat who asked, would a countywide school district solve segregation? And Jennifer, I think that's a really great question. That's been the toxic thing since the 1930s when it was first proposed, and again in the 60s. White folks in the suburbs do not want that to happen. But a majority of people of color, I think over 65%, say they would be open to it. And I think over 50% of white parents are now starting to say, according to what do they call it, the Presbyterian Church, they did a big study with the Community Foundation. They found over 50% of parents are white parents, I think, if I'm not quite right on those numbers, are open to that idea, which is a huge shift from 20 years ago. But I think folks like Kara Finnegan, researcher at the U of R, talks a lot about a regional approach and maybe something that is a little bit different than just chopping up the school district, but something that could both achieve integration, but also really equity, because that's another problem, that when things are integrated sometimes, it's white people that benefit and people of color who often can be negatively impacted, especially when it comes to leadership positions or positions of power. Thousands of African-American teachers who are incredible anti-racist educators lost their job after Brown versus Board because the white school districts that took over the black school districts wouldn't hire them. and we had similar issues in our community. And so I think that there's some real big issues to look at. And so to have a regional approach that's really thought out, I think is huge. And I'll share a book in the chat, but that's Kara Finnegan's book. I strongly recommend reading it if you're serious about truly equitable approaches to school integration. Do you have any other ones in there?
We are checking in. My helpers can jump in when you see something.
I see Janice said that PTAs have to advocate for more diverse teachers, and we have teachers teaching in the city and returning home to the suburbs. Schools need to encourage administrators to hire minority teachers for students in the suburbs as well as in the city. I think that's huge, but I think that we can't do that unless we create significant support for those teachers of color. Because I don't know, I can't imagine what it'd be like for me to go into a school where I was the only white teacher on staff. But my good friend that I run an anti-racist book club with in Rush-Henrietta, she's the only teacher of color at my school out of 50-something teachers. And she speaks very openly about how incredibly uncomfortable it's been over her last 20 years in our school district. And we got to talk about changing the racist systems and structures and even cultures in some of our schools. And parents have to be a part of that support process. But I think that's a big part of that solution. So thanks for that, Janice. Teresa kind of also speaking to that about the hiring process.
Yep.
And I appreciate, Teresa, you're acknowledging that inaction plays a part of this. We've got to take that action, like Ibram Kendi calls us to. It's not enough to just want to change. We have to be a part of that. I really like that.
Yep. Okay, if someone has a question, again, you can raise your hand or go ahead and unmute yourself, ask your question, then mute yourself.
Are people allowed to mute themselves?
Oh, maybe
They might
not.
not be able to. Oh, I think Leah's got something to share.
I have to raise. Yeah, I think if they raise their hand, one of us can unmute them.
We're having trouble hearing you, Kim.
Okay, she said if you raise your hand, we can unmute you.
Hi, I'm Leah. I was
Hi,
just
Leah.
I just added on the chat just about it kind of in relation to what Teresa and I believe Janice also shared, the hiring practices. And as I've noticed as I've now been in the suburbs for 4 years that there are not a lot of people of color in the administrative seats. And often when I've gone to professional developments, I look around and I'm maybe one of only a handful. And so not to say that it's purposeful, but when we talk about it, I think someone else said it, we've got to make it more welcoming. So the discussions around that and what does that look like? What does that mean? As well as looking at the hiring practices, a little statement on a hiring form doesn't mean that you really are welcoming and representing all aspects, because you don't have someone at the table to help with that decision process of what it is you're looking for and what different perspective that person might bring to the table. It may not necessarily be what people are looking for because they don't yet know. So just some patterns and things, and we're starting some great discussions in my building with the hope that maybe it will spread into the rest of the school community.
Yes, thank you, Leah. And as I shared with some people on our board, that preparing, and someone said they were surprised that we would actually have to prepare parents to receive a teacher of color in the district. But I do know that even in the city school district, the ratio of Black to white teachers compared to the student demographics is, pretty stark. And at my daughter's previous school, in 2011, they got their first Black teacher. And this is a city school that has 90+% Black and Latino student population. But when this teacher came, some of the few white parents that were there actually pulled their children or asked to be place their children in a different classroom. So those are the kind of things that I think as PTAs, we can, when we know these things exist, try to get in front of and have a plan and prepare a plan for those kind of behaviors and backlash. And so that's something I just like to throw out there to think about.
I love that, Rosalind. I feel like PTAs have the power to call these things out and the community strength to be a part of that. Alexandra asked a great question. She says, how do I find out the status of the anti-racist curriculum in your district? Well, one of the things you can do is definitely reach out to your school board, your superintendent, or your district's assistant superintendent of instruction.
You're muted, Shane.
Man, I just said a bunch of stuff. This is round 2 of muting and talking. Oh, man. So one of the great question from Alexandra Powell saying, how do I find the status of the anti-racist curriculum in your district? The best thing that you can do is reach out and advocate with your superintendent or school board members or your student's principal. Also, the assistant superintendent of instruction would probably be the person who knows most about what's going on. And I strongly recommend that you reach out and even share this FAQ sheet that I just put in the chat with them. It gives the basics of the project and how to get in touch with our team at the Pathstone Foundation. And it also will give you some talking points to kind of help with that conversation. But I can give some examples, like in Fairport, a couple of parents, a diverse group of white and Black parents came together and organized. And they signed a petition with thousands of signatures saying they wanted this curriculum taught in their school. And people responded to that in the district. The deputy mayor of the town hosted our team to speak, and we had almost 350 folks from Fairport come out to learn about the project. And then we've been training almost all of the 4th grade teachers in Fairport already in piloting and teaching this project with their kids. I know parents in Penfield have been working hard on trying to get that to happen there. And there's been some progress. I think there's some opening this spring for some 4th grade teachers. In a number of other districts, we've been very actively working in. Spencerport will be training all of their 4th grade teachers in the coming weeks, and a number of others. We've trained almost 200 teachers in our 3-hour professional development, which is free. And we've trained around 700 or more teachers in just the lecture, a longer version of the lecture you saw, and then some specifics in what it means to be anti-racist in the classroom and what the curriculum looks like that they might try in their classrooms. And then we also offer support. We offer coaching for teachers and free consulting for administrators to help navigate this work. So please reach out. Everything, the curriculum is free. We are funded by the ESL Foundation, Greater Rochester Health Foundation, United Way, the Rochester Realtors Charitable, Farish, and Paychecks, Bank of America. I don't know, we raised almost $500,000. So we are set for the next 3 years to offer a free curriculum, training, and free curriculum for any community in Monroe County. And we'd love to work with districts and other places and share what we've been doing. The other thing I can say about that project, though, is that for it to work, districts need to know that parents are behind their kids learning this. And so your advocacy and taking that anti-racist step of sending that email, having that phone call, or of learning more about what we're doing so that you feel good advocating for it, I think is incredibly important, or advocating for all the other great work that is going around across our nation when it comes to trying to create these changes in classrooms. So yes, Teresa, everything is free. We're also building a professional website with the RIT, Digital Humanities, and the Magic Lab. And that will be a very fancy website that TGW Design Studios is building too. I don't know, the funders like fancy stuff. So they were like, you gotta have a website. And we were like, okay. And the website's gonna have a map of all the racial covenants on it. And so a number of students at U of R are helping build that with GIS mapping and uncovering more covenants in their towns and telling the stories of each of these different towns and areas in an interactive map. And then also all the curriculum will be housed. So any parent could read all the curriculum, any teacher, any administrator. It's all free, open access. A number of districts have taken it and slightly adapted it for the needs of their school. We love to be there to help with that. But some districts are taking things and using it for themselves. We just want people to make sure they're teaching this in the classroom. And we want to help make it happen in the best way. So great question there, Teresa, about the cost and then about how you reach out to know what's happening. And you could also reach out to me. I'm going to share a link here with my information. My email's right here at the top. And then also a recording of this presentation and the slides and some resources about the project are also there. And you can see that in the link I just shared. Feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk to you or connect you with parents in other districts that have been successful at getting their school districts to teach some of this curriculum. And I just talked for way too long. I apologize. So someone else, please unmute and ask a question, share some thoughts, or I'd love to hear your pushback or feedback as well.
Hey, Shane. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to say just a few things because we've been putting a in Penfield, and we have been putting a lot of pressure on our administration lately through our parent groups, and I'm having a little bit of difficulty because I do really feel for, you know, my kids have been in the district for a while, and I really feel for our administrators and our teachers because I know they're really struggling right now. So to ask them to add more curriculum or more research and more professional development, I want to, like, it's really important. But on the other hand, I know they're drowning right now. Like, how do we balance this?
Jennifer, that's an amazing question. I'll tell you, I teach fourth grade full time. I have 22 kids. I'm remote, and it's rough. It's super rough. But I will also say that in the current political and historic moment that we are in right now, with a pandemic where people of color are dying at 4 times the rate in Monroe County, where people of color are being killed by police officers, and thousands of folks are erupting in protest in the street. This afternoon, we led a session with a bunch of youth at the Urban League's after-school program, and half of those youth had protested in Rochester. These are 14 to 18-year-olds. Like, they shouldn't have to do that, and yet that is the place that we're in our communities. And our kids, both in the suburbs and the city, they know that there's big problems going on with racial injustice, and they're scared, they're confused, and they need context for this moment. And to put it in that historical context, to me, although it is incredibly difficult, I would much rather, all teachers are getting PD right now in lots of things. I would much rather have our focus be on this kind of PD instead of on Common Core testing or Common Core ELA. To me, this is the thing that we advocate for at this moment, because this one fits in with the Common Core and the ELA standards, but it's just good teaching, but it's what kids want to know. After George Floyd was killed, it was literally the week before we started our redlining unit, and I started with Rufus Fairwell, who in 1962 in the Red Line Plymouth Exchange neighborhood was brutally beaten by Rochester police officers for locking up a gas station that he owned on Plymouth and Columbia. Now, they thought he was robbing it, and so he was brutally beaten. He and Reverend Gibson at Memorial AME led hundreds of people to City Hall in what might be the first Black Lives Matter protest in Rochester. And to show that, talk about the killing of Denise Hawkins, of Alicia McCullers, and help kids see this context, and that each time it's in redline neighborhoods, and then to look at the demographic backup, those hard facts reports. I mean, kids are starting to realize, oh, my community is pretty segregated. Why is that? And instead of dismissing those questions, I think we got to face them head on. And so I think when you advocate making it personal, acknowledging the difficulty for teachers, because it's super real right now, but that the difficulty for kids, in my opinion, is even greater with trying to understand the world right now, wanting answers and needing that support. So I hope that helps, Jennifer. And I think I saw Jess Krupa over there, my good friend from Rush-Henrietta, I think.
Yeah, hey Shane, how are you?
Hey.
So one of the things I was thinking about and has been discussed is, and something that we could do, I think probably at a PTA level, is just continue to offer activities and things within the school that really bring everybody together and that's interesting for every kid, and trying to make those kids that don't necessarily, or those families that might not feel comfortable in school, or like school is a place where they're accepted. We could start as a PTA by doing that. And I think that leads into that whole thought about kids enjoying school. If they enjoy school and it's something they like, then maybe those kids will go out and want to be teachers. I think it kind of leads into that whole, if kids don't enjoy school, why would they go to school for education? And then that in turn leads to not having the pool of candidates to hire from, you know? So I think when we think about it, I feel like it feels really, really daunting. But then if we can think about it in these smaller pieces and think, okay, let's just, you know, besides the advocacy and the curriculum, which is super important, and you're doing amazing with that, by the way. And anybody that knows Shane knows that his kids love him. He's an awesome teacher. But PTAs can start with that, right? Like pooling the families and just finding things that are interesting for them, and then being able to pull families in that might not feel welcomed in school, or maybe who as those parents as kids didn't have the most enjoyable time. So maybe they're going to now put that view on their kids. We can change that. I don't know, just something.
I love what you're saying there, Jess. I think that's really important to start moving the ball with those kinds of things that invite more people in. And one of the challenges that I would offer is in a lot of these PTAs, I know they're majority white spaces in our county. And I think that sometimes we need to look at our own institutions like PTAs and ask, what are we doing that's making where we are so unwelcoming, or that people aren't coming? Maybe it's not intentional at all, but what is happening? And be able to kind of like put our pride aside and say, what can we change? Reach out to people of color and just say, I'm not going to be defensive. Can you just tell me, like, what are your thoughts about why you don't come to the PTA here? What could we do to make it a place that you would want to come? What are those changes? Do that kind of outreach instead of just more email blasts. You know, I think those kinds of things can be huge, and have events where people want to come, or like Namiko was saying at the beginning, inviting people to come and have some type of role or job. I think that always helps too. Thanks for that, Jess.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Namiko.
Okay, I actually have two questions. When you teach your anti-racist curriculum to students, I know SEL is a big thing now. Mental health and racism is real, and I know that you specifically omitted some things to us, but for the kids, I mean, what is their, because it's traumatic, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So are you? I know you're not sugarcoating it. There's no way to sugarcoat it. But how do you teach that to children when it is so traumatic?
I think that is such an important question, and we've been really careful about how we do that. I think the first thing about it is that our team who is writing this curriculum is we're 75% African-American team. And there are people who've lived this and experienced it. And a lot of things have been changed that I originally had when it was just me, because they were like, this isn't okay to show students of color in 4th grade or even 8th grade sometimes.
Right.
So that's a big piece. Another big piece is we do a 3-hour training that's explicitly on culturally responsive sustaining curriculum, which is part of the New York State standards, and on the social emotional learning framework, part of the New York State standards. So you might recognize this document right here, this little image, the social emotional wheel. So for every single lesson, there's specific pieces of the social emotional component that are pre-taught to teachers at the beginning, with teaching tips explicitly about the things that might come up for kids, especially from the teachers of color who have taught this curriculum in their class, have then come back and been like, this really worked, or this was something that I think it was too much for kids, or here's a way to introduce it so that it isn't traumatic, but helps kids be empowered by facing these stories. And we do the same thing when it comes to culturally responsive teaching tips, using the teaching tolerance standards, that CRSE framework, as well as teaching tips kind of throughout the actual curriculum and strategies that kids can use, like with breathing, or with the stop and think, the fist to 5 strategy for checking in non-verbally about how they're feeling, and a whole host of other strategies that we've really intentionally incorporated, because the last thing we want to do is cause trauma. Our goal is to empower kids. We can't sugarcoat it, and we're not sugarcoating it in 4th grade, but what we're putting in front of kids at each grade level fits with the teaching tolerance standards for that grade level, for what is developmentally and social emotionally appropriate. So kids aren't going to see that image of like the Ku Klux Klan in 4th grade. To me, that is terrifying to see. or the newspaper article about a family getting stones thrown through their windows. Like I can't imagine what it would be like to see something, but kids do need to know that home ownership rates are 3 times higher for whites than Black people of color in our community. They can see that. They can see the redlining map, that language that bars people of color. They see that the government put those deeds on their homes. And then they can learn about Dr. Cooper. Like, he fought against, when his wife had their son, Robert, they went to Strong Hospital, and there was a separate and unequal segregated ward for people of color. And that was at Strong until the mid-1960s. That's according to Dr. Cooper, but also the Rochester Medical Journal out of U of R. And to have kids hear those kinds of stories, they're not seeing like how awful those conditions might be, but they're hearing that oral history from Dr. Cooper. Or Connie Mitchell, they're learning about her running for public office and getting elected because of redlining, right? But like, we're not showing them some of the scariest stuff that Connie faced, but we are talking about how, like, the house down the street had 20 mailboxes on it. You had 20 families living in a house that was like a 2-family house because there's nowhere else for people of color to live. So we're trying to be really careful and thoughtful about both what we choose, but also how we introduce it. And then train teachers to explicitly, the teachers in the training, they don't get this presentation. They do the jigsaw, common source, and mystery source. They share their thinking, and then they see those standards and those frameworks and tips, and they think about like how 2 master teachers taught it to them and how they can both use that and be informed by those practices to make sure kids are really safe and supportive, but also empowered to take change. And that's the key. No racist policy is shown without someone of color and sometimes a white friend fighting back against that. And we also have that for Latinx and Asian American communities as part of the work that we're doing, because I think all those pieces are really crucial. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned the CRS framework. Just so everybody knows, the New York State PTA is part of that team. Myself and Kyle, the executive director, we are on the CRS framework team. So we're trying to implement it across the state. We've been hammering at it and figuring out how to get that out. And hopefully we can get that out to you by February. And we're counting on parents and PTA to have a major part in it and the rollout. So, but thank you for mentioning that.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We've quickly come up on the end of our time, but I do see other questions in the chat, and I do want to make mention that this is just part 1. We will come back together and talk about these things a little more with some really concrete actions that we can take as PTA units or parent groups in general and community members. And so look out for an email from us. We know where you are, and we will let you know when that will be sometime early in the new year, our follow-up discussion on all of this. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia, and she'll close us out.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosalind. And thank you, Shane, for bringing us your passion and thoughts to us this evening. An appreciation coming to your inbox soon. We're going to present you with a gift membership to the Empire State PTSA. This is a PTA unit that is a statewide unit that includes people who are leaders in the field of education and who are interested in children's issues. So that's coming to your inbox soon. And we certainly appreciate the time and effort that you put to bring us your thoughts and your research this evening. I also want to take a moment to recognize Rosalind Walker. This event would not have been possible without her vision and leadership. And so in appreciation, Rosalind, for your work with our Region Board for over 5 years, the Region Board is presenting you with a New York State PTA Honorary Life Membership Award, which is coming your way, which is coming your way very soon. So we appreciate your effort and your vision in bringing this and future events to us.
Okay, thank you. And before everyone leaves, I know we had a lot of conversations in the chat. I recommend that you save the chat. And if you don't know how to do that in Zoom, look to the lower right-hand corner to the right of the file button, and you'll see 3 little dots. Click that, and right at the top of the menu says Save Chat, and all the comments and links and information that was shared will be saved in a file, and you'll have all that on your device.
So thanks everybody for coming to our event. We will be sending out a survey link very shortly to your inbox. We certainly want to hear your feedback on this event. And as Rosalind mentioned, we are hoping that this is part 1 of many events. And if you're interested in helping us organize future events or being part of a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee or network within our region, please reach out to us and let us know. Thanks again for attending, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, everyone.